Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. The HOA just told me my house is unapproved and I need to move out immediately. There's just one problem. I own the entire neighborhood. This is going to be fun. It all started on a quiet Tuesday morning when I stepped outside to grab my mail, only to find a bright red notice taped to my front door. Violation was stamped in bold, aggressive letters, followed by a list of ridiculous infractions: unapproved exterior color, unauthorized mailbox, and the best one, occupying residence without HOA approval. I stared at the paper, half expecting it to be some kind of prank. After all, this was my house. I had bought it, paid for it in full, and was in the middle of some minor renovations before deciding whether to flip or rent it out. More importantly, I wasn't just the homeowner. I was the landlord of this entire neighborhood. Before I could process the absurdity of the situation, I heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking against pavement. Turning around, I came face to face with Linda, the HOA president. She had the kind of energy that could make even the most patient person want to flip a table. Rigid posture, clipboard in hand, and a smug expression that screamed, "I live for unnecessary power trips." "Good morning," she said with a tight smile. "I assume you've seen the notice?" I glanced down at the paper again, then back at her. "Yeah, I have some questions." Her smile barely wavered. "Of course, but first let's go over the main issue. You're living here without HOA approval." I raised an eyebrow. "I own this house." Linda waved a dismissive hand. "Ownership isn't the issue. You didn't submit the proper residency application. Every homeowner has to be approved by the HOA board before moving in." I blinked. "You do realize that's insane, right?" She let out a short laugh, as if I had just said something adorable. "It's standard practice to maintain the quality of our neighborhood. You'll need to vacate immediately until we complete the review process. Otherwise, we'll start issuing fines." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. She had no idea who she was talking to. Instead of arguing, I decided to play along. "All right, so what's the process?" Linda's eyes gleamed, sensing victory. "We need your application, background check, proof of income, and a personal statement on why you believe you'd be a good fit for the community." I almost choked. A personal statement from my own house? Her expression was dead serious. "Yes, the board will review it in our next meeting, 6 weeks from now." I had to admire her audacity. Not only was she illegally trying to evict me from my own property, but she was also clearly enjoying every second of it. I glanced over at my neighbors, who were all watching the exchange from a safe distance. Some looking sympathetic, others clearly relieved it wasn't them in my position. 6 weeks is a long time," I said, folding my arms. "What am I supposed to do until then?" Linda gave me a saccharine smile. "You're welcome to stay in a hotel. Of course, we have a list of HOA-approved short-term rentals." I bet she did at this point. I could have shut her down right then and there. A single phone call to my lawyer would have been enough to put an end to this nonsense. But something about the way she carried herself, the unshakable confidence, the assumption that she held all the power, made me pause. How deep did this corruption go? I had heard murmurs from other homeowners about unfair fines and impossible rules, but I had never paid much attention. Now it was happening to me, and I had the perfect opportunity to expose everything. I decided to lean into the act. "I'll have to think about my options," I said. "In the meantime, I assume there's a way to appeal?" Linda's expression didn't change, of course, but I wouldn't waste your time. "The board rarely grants exceptions." "Perfect," I nodded, pretending to be dejected. "Thanks for the info." As she turned to leave, I couldn't help myself. "Oh, one last thing," I said casually. "Just out of curiosity, who are the HOA officers?" Linda frowned, caught off guard by the question. "That's irrelevant. The HOA board controls all decisions regarding community properties." I grinned. "Good to know." She walked away, confident she had just put me in my place. Little did she know, I was about to turn her entire world upside down. The moment Linda walked away, I knew I had to dig deeper. The sheer confidence with which she delivered her nonsense suggested this wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a pattern, a racket. And if she had the gall to try and evict me, someone with the power to end her entire HOA dictatorship, then she was probably getting away with much worse when dealing with my tenants and the other homeowners. I started by reaching out to some of the other residents under the guise of figuring out my options. The reactions were immediate and intense. One man, a retired veteran named Carl, practically growled when I mentioned my situation. "They've been running this place like a damn mafia for years," he said. "They hit me with a fine last month because my American flag was too large." Can you believe that? A single mother, Jasmine, told me she had been paying hundreds in mysterious compliance fees for years. "I tried to fight it once," she said, lowering her voice like we were in some kind of underground resistance. "But they just doubled my fines the next month, said my driveway had unauthorized cracks." What does that even mean? The more people I talked to, the more obvious it became. Linda and her board weren't just enforcing the rules. They were making them up as they went, using fear and financial penalties to keep homeowners under their thumb. And those who pushed back, well, they faced aggressive legal threats, constant inspections, and in extreme cases, foreclosure notices. It was a full-blown reign of terror, and the HOA was cashing in big time. To confirm my suspicions, I decided to take a look at their finances. As the actual owner of the neighborhood, I had access. Access to the HOA's records was something Linda and her cronies clearly hadn't accounted for. What I found was even worse than I imagined. Tens of thousands of dollars in maintenance fees that didn't actually go toward maintenance. A separate slush fund labeled board discretionary expenses that seemed to exclusively fund luxurious business retreats at five-star resorts. And most damning of all, an off-the-books account where money from excessive fines had been funneled completely unaccounted for. They weren't just corrupt, they were straight-up stealing from the homeowners. As if on cue, the next day, a new notice appeared on my door. This one wasn't just a fine, it was an eviction warning. Apparently, my failure to comply had escalated things. According to the letter, I had 1 week to vacate before they took legal action. I nearly laughed. They were trying to evict me from my own house in a neighborhood I owned. They still had no idea. Instead of immediately responding, I let them think they were winning. I started racking up fines left and right, parking my car an inch too far from the curb, leaving my trash can out a little longer than necessary, even switching out my mailbox just to see what they'd do. Sure enough, they kept adding more violations, more fees, more threats. It was almost impressive how eagerly they walked into their own downfall. Then came the emergency HOA meeting. Linda announced it with the kind of dramatic urgency usually reserved for national crises. Every homeowner was strongly encouraged to attend as the board discussed ongoing threats to community harmony. Translation: it was a public spectacle to make an example out of me. I showed up early, sitting near the back as the room filled with homeowners, most of whom were exhausted and beaten down from years of arbitrary rule. Linda and the board sat at the front, their usual smug expressions plastered on their faces. "As you all know," Linda began, her voice using fake concern, "we've had an unfortunate situation arise regarding a homeowner who refuses to follow our community standards. In the interest of preserving the integrity of our neighborhood, the board has unanimously decided to move forward with legal action to remove the resident in question." All eyes turned toward me. I leaned back in my chair, giving her my best, "Oh, this is going to be fun" smile. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" she asked, clearly expecting some kind of desperate plea. I stood up, stretching slightly before speaking. "Yeah, I have a question. Can you explain how exactly you plan to evict me from a house I own?" Linda scoffed. "Ownership does not exempt you from community guidelines. If you fail to comply, we have the right to reclaim the property." I nodded slowly. "Got it. And just to be clear, what happens to the house after you reclaim it?" She barely hesitated. "The HOA will manage it appropriately." I cut her off. "You mean sell it? Auction it? Maybe take a cut of the sale?" Her lips thinned. "That's standard HOA procedure," I smirked. "Right? Where exactly does the money from these fines go?" She stiffened. "Into the HOA maintenance fund, of course." I pulled out a stack of papers, flipping to the very interesting parts. "That's weird because according to these financial records, ones I legally have access to, by the way, there's a significant amount of money that isn't going to maintenance at all. Would you care to explain the $42,000 retreat to Hawaii labeled as a business planning session, or maybe the consulting fees paid to a company that doesn't seem to exist. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Linda's face lost a bit of color. Those are private HOA expenditures, and you have no right to— Actually, I interrupted. I do, because you forgot one important thing. I let the moment stretch, making sure every single person in that room was paying attention. I own this neighborhood. Silence. Linda's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. One of the board members nearly choked on his water. A few homeowners audibly whispered, "Wait, what?" I held up the documents that proved it. That's right, every single house in this community, including yours, is owned by me, which means technically you all answer to me. Linda stammered, That's not how it works." I grinned. "Oh, but it is. And since I own the properties, I also have full legal authority to review all HOA financials, override board decisions, and, oh yeah, dissolve the HOA entirely." The room erupted. Some people cheered, others gasped. Linda looked like she might pass out. I let the chaos settle for a second before adding, "Oh, and by the way, your little eviction attempt? Yeah, that's fraud, and I've got a real estate attorney who would love to have a chat about that." Linda stumbled back in her chair, gripping the table as if it might somehow save her. The rest of the board members were already inching toward the exit. "Now," I said, stepping forward, "let's talk about some changes around here." The entire room was still reeling from the bombshell I had just dropped. Homeowners exchanged stunned glances, board members fidgeted nervously, and Linda sat frozen, her usual smug expression wiped clean off her face. She opened her mouth, then closed it again as if scrambling for some way to regain control. "This doesn't change anything," she finally managed, gripping her clipboard like a lifeline. "The HOA operates independently of property ownership. We still enforce the rules." I chuckled. "Linda, I'm not just a property owner. I'm the property owner you've been trying to evict me from a house I own in a neighborhood I own, using an HOA that I legally have the power to dismantle." I leaned forward slightly, enjoying the way she shrank back. "Tell me, does that sound like a smart move to you?" She swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the rest of the board for support, but they were already abandoning ship. One member, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, cleared his throat. Well, perhaps. We should review the legalities before proceeding any further," I grinned. "Oh, don't worry. I already had my lawyer do that. Turns out you've been running this HOA in violation of multiple state regulations, charging illegal fines, misappropriating funds, and my personal favorite, forging homeowners' signatures on policy changes." Gasps rippled through the room. A woman in the front row shot to her feet. "Wait, what are you saying? They've been faking our approvals." I turned to her. "Yep, some of these rules were never actually voted on. The board just wrote them up and filed them as if the community agreed." I pulled out a thick stack of documents and waved them in the air. "And these records prove it." The panic was visible now. Linda's hands clenched around her clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. "This is ridiculous. You don't have the authority to—" I cut her off, pulling out one last document. "Actually, I do. Since I own the majority of properties in this neighborhood, I have majority voting power. That means I can override any HOA decision." I let the weight of my words sink in before delivering the final blow. "Which means, Linda, you're fired." The room erupted. Some people cheered, others just gawked in shock, processing the fact that the iron grip of the HOA had just been shattered in an instant. Linda shot out of her chair, shaking with fury. "You can't do this. I won't let you destroy this community." "I'm not destroying anything," I said calmly. "I'm saving it from you." A homeowner near the back raised his hand. "So what happens now?" I smiled. "Now we clean house, refund every bogus fine, repeal every ridiculous rule, and most importantly, we make sure this," I gestured toward the terrified board members, "never happens again." Linda looked around, searching for an ally, finding none. She turned back to me, her face twisting in fury. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You think you've won, but—" I held up a finger. Careful what you say, because technically I also have the right to evict anyone abusing HOA power, And guess who's at the top of that list? Her face drained of color. "You have 30 days to vacate," I said, savoring the moment. "But don't worry, I'll be gracious. No fines, no penalties, just pack up and go." For the first time, Linda was speechless. She looked like she might explode, but with the entire neighborhood watching, she had no move left to make. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was brief before someone finally broke it with a slow clap, then another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause, people cheering, clapping, and shaking my hand. I just smiled, knowing this was only the beginning. The HOA's reign of terror was over, and now it was time to build something better. The aftermath of Linda's downfall spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Homeowners who had been living in fear for years suddenly found themselves free from the ridiculous rules, absurd fines, and constant harassment. But just because Linda had been removed didn't mean the mess she left behind was going to clean itself up. I wasted no time in making things right. The first order of business was digging into the HOA's finances. Now that Linda and her cronies were out, I had full access to everything they had been hiding. And what I found was worse than I had even anticipated. Misallocated funds, double-billed maintenance fees, thousands of dollars missing with no explanation. There was even an entire line item labeled board member bonuses, which was just a fancy way of saying they were paying themselves with the community's money. The homeowners were furious. People who had been slapped with outrageous fees over nonsense infractions were now realizing their money had never actually gone to neighborhood improvements. It had been funding vacations, spa days, and personal expenses for the HOA board. One resident, an older man named Tom M., clenched his fists as he flipped through the financial records I laid out at the next community meeting. They charged me $500 for excessive yard decorations, and meanwhile, they were using our money to rent yachts. A woman next to him, who had been fined for having the wrong shade of blue on her front door, shook her head in disbelief. "Can we sue them?" I grinned. Funny you should ask. As it turned out, not only could we sue them, but we had to. Embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of funds weren't just shapes. They were criminal offenses. I had already spoken to my lawyer, who was more than happy to move forward with legal action. The lawsuits hit Linda and her former board members hard. Their personal assets were frozen. Their bank accounts were investigated. Some of them even tried to claim they had no idea what was happening until receipts, emails, and meeting transcripts proved otherwise. The best part? Every penny they had stolen was court-ordered to be returned to the homeowners. Meanwhile, the community itself underwent a total transformation. First, I refunded every bogus fine Linda had ever issued. People who had been paying ridiculous compliance fees suddenly got checks in the mail with full reimbursements. A few homeowners were so shocked they thought it was a mistake. Next, I went through every ridiculous HOA rule and wiped out the worst offenders. No more approved grass height nonsense. No more surprise inspections for unapproved curtain colors. No more ridiculous fines for parking 1 inch too close to the curb. Homeowners started celebrating their newfound freedom in the best ways possible. Grills popped up in front yards, American flags flew proudly, and someone even installed a giant inflatable flamingo on their lawn, just because they could. But the best moment came when it was time for Linda to face the final consequence of her actions. Since she had been using HOA funds for personal gain and had technically been illegally collecting fines, she was now not only facing lawsuits, but also eviction from the very house she had weaponized against others. The irony was delicious. I made sure to give her the same courtesy she had given me. A single notice on her door. "Violation. You have 30 days to vacate." When she saw it, she nearly collapsed on the spot. She tried to fight it, of course. Threats, legal posturing, even an attempt to plead for mercy. But the law was the law, and this time she was on the losing side. On the day she left, a small crowd gathered to watch as she loaded up a moving truck. Her face twisted in humiliation. Just before she got in her car, she turned to me, seething. "You think you've won?" I smiled. "No, Linda, everyone has won except you." With that, she sped off, leaving behind a neighborhood that was finally free from her reign of terror. The HOA, once a tool of oppression, was now nothing more than a fair, resident-run committee that actually worked for the homeowners instead of against them. And as for me, well, let's just say that watching the downfall of a power-hungry HOA dictator was the most satisfying real estate deal I'd ever made. With Linda gone and the HOA officially dismantled, the neighborhood transformed overnight. What had once been a place ruled by fear, nitpicking, and nonsense fines was now a true community. People who had never spoken to their neighbors before were suddenly organizing block parties, helping each other with home projects, and most importantly, enjoying their homes without constant harassment. For the first time in years, homeowners had the final say over their own properties. There were no more arbitrary rules, no more threats of foreclosure over mailbox dials, and no more corrupt board members siphoning money for their personal vacations. The money that had once been funneled into Linda's personal slush fund was redistributed to actual neighborhood improvements, new streetlights, better landscaping, and even a community space where people could gather and actually enjoy living here. And the cherry on top? Property values skyrocketed without the restrictive HOA regulations scaring off buyers. The market exploded. People wanted to live in a neighborhood that actually respected homeowners' rights. Houses that had been stuck on the market for months suddenly had multiple offers. For those who had been considering selling, the power shift meant they could finally profit instead of being held hostage by pointless HOA demands. Of course, there were still a few former HOA diehards who weren't happy about the change. The ones who had thrived under Linda's rule. The ones who enjoyed writing complaints about the length of someone's grass. They grumbled about the downfall of community standards, but they quickly realized they were in the minority. Nobody missed the old HOA. Nobody wanted it back. One day, as I walked through the neighborhood, enjoying the sight of people actually smiling in their own front yards, Carl, the veteran who had been fined over his flag, stopped me. "You did good, kid," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Never thought I'd see the day where I could just live in my damn house without someone breathing down my neck." That was all the thanks I needed. But the best moment came a few weeks later when I made one final change. The old HOA office, the very place where Linda and her board had once sat deciding the fates of homeowners over coffee and stolen HOA funds, was repurposed into a community center. Instead of being a place of fear, it became a space for neighborhood events, kids' activities, and real discussions about making the area better. No board meetings, no secret fines, just people actually working together instead of being controlled. And as for Linda, well, last I heard she tried to join another HOA board in a different neighborhood. Unfortunately for her, news travels fast. When prospective communities heard about her little incident here, she found herself blacklisted from every HOA in the area. Poetic justice. This whole thing started because the HOA thought they could push around the wrong person. They thought they could bully me into compliance, stack fines until I folded, and control a house I legally owned. They forgot one simple fact. I wasn't just a homeowner. I was their landlord, and the landlord always wins. Now, if you enjoyed this insane HOA drama, don't forget to hit that like button, drop a comment about the craziest HOA story you've ever heard, and make sure you're subscribed for more wild real estate tales. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.